Hey, what's up guys, Matt with the Movement System. In this video, we're going to talk about strength and conditioning for sprinters. So if you're a sprinting coach, a track and field coach, or a sprinter yourself, you're going to get a lot of benefit out of this. We're going to talk about the needs analysis, so the energy system demands of sprinting, the unique movement demands involved in sprinting, and then we're going to get into an actual program and analyzing different movements that I would program for a sprinter. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so let's start off with the energy system analysis. And in the case of sprinting, most sprinters, if we're thinking about true track and field sprinters, are sprinting between 10 and 25 seconds. So we're going to focus on the 100 and 200 meter sprinters. So for those sprinters, the primary energy system is the ATP-PC system with some contribution from anaerobic glycolysis. What this means is that sprinters are getting most of their energy from stored adenosine triphosphate, which is a molecule in the muscles that's kind of ready to go and split and immediately provide us with energy. Some of their energy is coming from anaerobic glycolysis, meaning that glucose molecules are breaking down. Either way, both of these energy systems are fast and do require a good amount of rest between work intervals. When we're training sprinters in season, we typically want to focus on their primary energy system. So most of the efforts in season and preseason are going to be in that range that they compete in, that 10 to 25 seconds. But when we're off season or very early preseason, we actually want to do what's called base work. And while we traditionally think of base work for field sport athletes as being aerobic, in the case of sprinters, their base work is actually going to be things like 400 meter runs or effort bouts that are about 40 seconds to maybe 90 seconds. This can be done through conditioning work in the gym with step-ups or marching or some positional tolerance type exercises like that. It can be done out in the field with 400, 800 meter sprints, typically not longer than 800 meters because again, that's not specific enough. Their base work really just needs to be one energy system above their performance energy system. And we're going to get into an example of that at the end of this. Let's move on to movement analysis. So when we think about sprinting, the primary movements involved are hip flexion and extension. The hips are a really important, powerful muscle group involved in sprinting. Also, we have the knee, and the knee is going to be a flexor and extensor. And importantly, we have to have eccentric control through the knee flexors. And that's going to be important when we think about the swing phase of running and actually slowing the forward progression of that leg in the swing phase. Also, we're going to have vertical force production. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. Sprinting is also going to involve the trunk for stability and power generation, as well as the arms. So there's going to be some amount of training that's dedicated to strength, some amount of training that's dedicated to force production, some amount of training that's dedicated to speed, and then also some amount of training that's dedicated to motor control and proprioception. One of the most important aspects of sprinting is rate of force development. And this is something that I did a whole other video on that you can check out. But rate of force development is a particular concern for training sprinters because most of the difference between a sprinter winning and not winning isn't their max strength, but rather it's actually their high rate of force development. So how quickly can they produce force in a very short period of time? So let's check out this graph here. What this graph is showing you is that in a very short period of time, for example, 0.1 or 0.2 seconds, you're not getting anywhere near peak force production. When sprinting in the acceleration phase, ground contact time is about 0.2 seconds. So that's a fifth of a second, very fast as you can imagine. But when we move into the max velocity phase of sprinting, it's even faster, about a tenth of a second. So as you can see on this graph, at 0.2 and 0.1 seconds, we're not anywhere near that max force. So rather, at that 0.1 or 0.2 second point on this curve, we need to make sure that our athlete's force profile has a significantly higher slope than the average athlete. And that will actually allow them to be off the blocks faster and also produce force quickly to maintain their maximal velocity sprinting throughout the end of the race. Some important characteristics of the acceleration phase of sprinting, typically the first 30 meters or so in the 100 meter sprint, for example, as our body is becoming more and more inclined. During this phase, we're going to have more horizontal force production, longer ground contact times, and greater degrees of hip, knee, and ankle flexion. By contrast, an athlete focused on the max velocity phase can do shorter excursion movements. The force profile of that athlete, it's more vertical force production up and down. It's going to be lesser degrees of hip, knee, and ankle flexion. And also there's going to be a more rapid eccentric load at max velocity compared to during the acceleration phase. During the acceleration phase, we're a little bit more concentric focused. So maybe we're getting into those deeper squat positions, and then we're doing a concentric focus jump out of that position to focus on training for acceleration. Whereas our max velocity phase training is going to be more like plyometric ankle hops or hurdle jumps, where we're focused on vertical force production and really quick ground contact times. Okay, so just to see how this graph carries over to training, if we think about that 0.1 and 0.2 seconds really being our sweet spot for training for sprinting, here's how other exercises line up on this graph. So a heavy squat might take about 3 seconds of ground contact time. So that would be at the very high end of this. No problem reaching max force production, but again, it's not going to be very specific to rate of force development. A little bit quicker is a counter movement jump, where we're squatting down and then jumping up. That's going to be about a half second of ground contact time. Again, it depends on the athlete. Moving into a depth jump, where we're stepping off of a box, contacting the ground, and then jumping up. Again, it depends on the height, but anywhere from about 0.15 to 0.3 seconds ground contact time for that depth jump. And then when we get into those continuous plyo hurdle jumps, focusing on that short ground contact time, we might be around 0.15 seconds. So that again is a little bit more specific towards those short ground contact times and towards rate of force development. That said, it's not a bad thing to be training max squats with heavy weights and long ground contact times. I'm not saying not to do it. All I'm saying is that it's not very specific to rate of force development, so you have to think about it as a different adaptation. That's an adaptation that's going to give the athlete a base of strength, and then they're going to have to add on that rate of force development training, possibly closer towards the season, to really build on that strength base, and that's what's going to get them to peak performance. And you might be wondering, well, Matt, why don't we just do a bunch of sprints? If all they need to do is rate of force development, and that's so important for their sprinting, why don't we just sprint every day? And that's a really good question. That's the most specific work, but that doesn't mean that we can do it year round. If we do that too long, we're going to develop muscular imbalances from the movement patterns of sprinting off the blocks the same way every time. We're going to develop a plateau in performance just from the fact that we're only training one adaptation, and we're not going to have a really high potential for this athlete because they don't have a lot of strength to build speed on. They're only going to build up to whatever their strength level is, and then they're not really going to be able to reach their peak performance. So that's why we need to strategically periodize strength and speed training. And that's a good segue into the force velocity curve. So I've been talking about this a lot lately in this program design series, and it's a really important concept to think about. And I want to give you guys some really concrete examples for sprinters on this force velocity curve today. So because sprinters are working really at the speed end of this, that's most specific for them. Farthest away from that speed point is max force, max strength, and strength speed. So that's going to be typically prioritized far away from competition, meaning like off season, early preseason, and then as we move through the preseason, we get a little bit more of our focus to be down towards that speed zone. So a good late off season or early preseason type of exercise might be strength speed work, and that, for example, might look like 70% of 1 rep max on a barbell back squat. That's a fairly heavy load, and we might be targeting about 0.75 meters per second on that type of movement so that we're getting that strength component but also focusing on speed. Another focus of the off-season / early preseason could be power, and a good target for power might be around 60% of 1 rep max, targeting about 0.9 meters per second. So a little bit lower load, a little bit faster for getting that power range. And then as we approach the late preseason, we might be getting into a little bit more speed strength work where it's more of an emphasis to get higher speeds of movement. So for speed strength, we might be loading around 40% 1 rep max and targeting 1.1 or so meters per second. So to give you a concrete example, if we're thinking about a trap bar deadlift and our sprinter has a max of 200 pounds on the trap bar deadlift, they might be doing 140 pounds for that strength speed zone, and they might be doing 120 pounds for power, or they might be doing about 80 pounds and then doing jumps with that trap bar for the speed strength. All right, let's go ahead and jump into analyzing a program here. So what you can see here is this is a preseason program with focus on power and speed strength. So what we're doing here is some combination of plyometrics, some combination of speed strength work, some combination of a little bit of muscle hypertrophy work at the end with some RDLs and stuff, what we'll see in calf raises. But this is really targeted for the movement patterns involved in sprinting. So What you'll see day one here is a 40-meter sled sprint. So we're going to load this up at about 25% body weight. That's not a ton of weight. These athletes will still be able to move here. So this would be in that speed strength zone. As you can see, we're going to do 6 sets of just that 40 meters here. What you'll notice is that programming is done A1, B1, C1, C2. So A1 would be done by itself, just with rest in between. B1 would be done by itself, and then when you see C1, C2, that would be a superset. So B1 is going to be a quarter rep barbell squat. So we're going to have athletes doing a really small range of motion, but you can actually see this is really heavy loaded at 80% 1 rep max. And I put this in here specifically to show you that even though this is a power and a speed strength focused program, we can have one exercise that's max force or max strength. And that's really our one exercise out of these 2 days, but the overall program is still a little bit more focused on that power and speed strength. Moving down to C1, we have lateral bounding jumps. These are just for time, 20 seconds. We're going to give the athlete probably 2 targets, like a cone, and jumping back and forth, sticking the landing there. And then we're going to superset that actually with our plyo push-ups, just on the ground, focusing on exploding off the ground here. Don't neglect upper body work just because they are a sprinter. It is a part of sprinting as well. Moving down into dumbbell single arm rows. So a little bit of strength work here with dumbbell single arm rows, supersetted with dumbbell RDLs. So just getting some hamstring strength there as well. About 75% 1 rep max. So a pretty good load for sets of 10 here on RDLs. And the last one is a Copenhagen plank, which you may have seen before. You put one leg up on a bench, and then you basically do a side plank. Moving down into day 2, we have actually some sprinting right off the bat. Depending on your relationship with the sport coach, if you are just the strength coach, or maybe you are the track coach and the strength coach, you may be putting sprinting into your program or not. But in the case that you are, maybe you'll do a 150-meter sprint. For example, this might be at 7 RPE for the first 3 and then an 8 RPE for the next 3, but not an all-out sprint, but you might have a time target for these athletes. Maybe that's 25, 20 seconds, depending on the level of your athlete for that 150 meters. But we're going to do 6 repeats of those. If it is taking about 20 seconds, we are going to want to give these athletes a pretty good amount of rest. If you want to check out my work to rest ratio video, I'll link that down in the comments so you can see exactly how to program rest depending on the work interval. All right, and then moving into a scissor jump. So that's going to be a lunge position. This is going to be a little bit of a deeper hip and knee flexion angle. So this is a little bit more specific to acceleration mechanics, but working 4 sets of 6 there. This is a plyometric, and technically the sprint is a plyometric as well, but we're going to kind of think about the scissor jumps, the hurdle jumps, the box knee drives as our 3 primary plyometrics. So that's about 72 reps of plyometrics. You really don't want to have an entire plyometric workout and then an entire strength workout. If you have, for example, 200 reps to spread out, you're better to spread that out between 3 days than to put all 200 reps of plyometrics on one day and then all your strength work on another day, just because that high volume of plyometrics would increase injury risk. It's a little bit better to probably spread that out to 70, 80, maybe 100 reps per training session. So then moving on to our hurdle hops. So that's just going to be a hurdle hop where we're setting up maybe a 30-inch hurdle and then jumping over. What you see next is that dumbbell step-up knee drive, and that exercise is going to be loaded at 30% 1 rep max. We just did unloaded plyometric movements. Now we're moving into loaded plyometric movements to move into more of this dynamic effort type of range where we're focused on producing force and also being quick. So this is really characteristic of that speed strength zone of the force velocity curve here. Moving into 3-way hip strength, and I did put strength here. We're going to do this ideally with a resistance machine. You can use bands if you need to, but working hip flexion, hip extension, and hip abduction here. And then moving into a side plank abduction. So this one's going to be working on obviously the trunk for the side plank, but then also hip abduction. We're going to lift that top leg, and you can either hold or you can just lift that leg up and down, and that's going to be done for 30 seconds, 2 times each side. And then lastly, moving into a calf raise. We're actually going to load this up pretty heavy. I didn't put a specific assignment of weight here, but if you have a machine, you can do this seated, you can do this standing. Probably a little bit more specific to a sprinter. If you can do it standing, you'll get a little bit more of a gastrocnemius focus. But we're going to just do 2 sets of 10 there. And we could do this pretty regularly throughout the off-season and preseason and in-season just to keep that strength work up in the calf as well as Achilles strength up. Alright guys, I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, make sure you go ahead and smash that like button. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment, or you can always send me a message on Instagram at The Movement System. If you want to learn more about strength conditioning, make sure you subscribe for more videos, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.